April 4th, 1939. Pylos, Greece. Within the first hour of digging on a dusty hilltop, a workman's shovel struck cut stone. Then, a fragment of a brightly painted fresco surfaced, its colors shockingly vibrant after 3,000 years. For American archaeologist Carl Blegen, it was a moment of terrifying confirmation. He had just found what the entire German academic establishment, the world's leading experts, had declared a myth. This is the story of how America's impossible search found the Palace of Nestor. Germany said couldn't be found, vindicating a literary legend in a single afternoon. Germany's final word. The ghost haunting these halls had a name: Heinrich Schliemann. A German-born tycoon who made a fortune in business, Schliemann was a man possessed by a single, lifelong obsession: to prove that the stories his father read to him as a boy, the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, were true. He was a force of nature, brilliant, driven, and utterly ruthless. In the 1870s, armed with his immense wealth and a copy of the Iliad, he traveled to modern-day Turkey, took Homer's geographical clues as a literal map, and began to dig at a hill called Hisarlik. What he found there made him a global celebrity overnight. He had discovered the ruins of a fortified city he triumphantly declared to be the legendary Troy. A few years later, he moved to mainland Greece, and, at the ancient citadel of Mycenae, discovered a circle of shaft graves containing a hoard of gold so spectacular that the world was left breathless. One golden funerary mask, he famously telegraphed to the king of Greece, was the face of Agamemnon himself. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the myths had sprung to life, but the professional academic community was mortified. Schliemann was a showman, a treasure hunter driven by ego, not a scientist guided by process. In his manic quest to find Homer's Troy, he had hired 150 laborers and blasted a massive trench, 45 feet deep, straight through the heart of the mound. This Great Trench, as it came to be known, sliced through 9 distinct layers of settlement, a vertical timeline of 4,000 years of human history. In his haste, he likely destroyed the very evidence he sought, pulverizing priceless artifacts and turning a complex archaeological site into a chaotic mess. The scientific establishment viewed his methods as a reckless butchering, a tragedy from which the field might never recover. More troubling still was the timeline. As scholars examined his finds, it became clear that the Priam's treasure he smuggled out of Turkey was, in fact, over 1,000 years older than the accepted date for the Trojan War. The mask of Agamemnon was centuries too old as well. Schliemann had found incredible things, but they weren't Homeric. The man sent to bring scientific order to the chaos was another German, Wilhelm Dörpfeld. He was everything Schliemann was not: methodical, patient, and precise. A trained architect, Dörpfeld carefully documented the different layers of Troy, establishing a clear stratigraphy. Yet, even his meticulous work failed to produce a city that matched Homer's grand descriptions. The Troy of the correct period was a relatively modest citadel, not the magnificent metropolis of the Iliad. There was no evidence of the towering walls, wide streets, or splendid palaces from the epic. This lack of definitive proof was all the ammunition the skeptics needed. The German academic establishment, led by the formidable Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Mellendorf, a titan of classical philology, delivered the final crushing verdict. Wilamowitz was the most influential classicist of his generation, and his word was practically law. He declared that the Iliad was not a historical account, but a tapestry of lies, a brilliant compilation of poems and folktales from different eras, woven together by a master poet, but historically worthless. The German approach of higher criticism, which analyzed ancient texts for internal inconsistencies and layers of authorship, had been applied to Homer, and the result was a declaration of its fictional nature. With that, the gatekeepers of ancient history had spoken. The official German position was solidified. Searching for Homeric palaces was a romantic and foolish quest, a waste of time and resources. The field of archaeology moved on, turning its attention to the serious study of later, better documented periods of Greek and Roman history. The Bronze Age, the supposed time of heroes, was abandoned, left to the poets and dreamers. The message was clear: do not follow in Schliemann's footsteps. Do not chase myths. The Palace of Nestor, the fabled home of the wise, silver-tongued king who fought at Troy, was officially deemed unfindable because, in all likelihood, it had never existed. But across the Atlantic, this dogma hadn't fully taken root. American archaeology was younger, less constrained by generations of rigid tradition, and more open to daring ideas. At the University of Cincinnati, a professor named Carl Blegen was quietly nursing a contrarian belief. Blegen was no wide-eyed romantic like Schliemann. He was, in fact, Schliemann's antithesis. A disciplined and deeply respected professional, he was known for his meticulous, almost surgical, excavation techniques. He had dug at Troy for 6 seasons, from 1932 to 1938, working alongside Dörpfeld's successors. He knew the site's problems and complexities better than almost anyone. He understood all the scholarly arguments against Homer's historical accuracy, but he wasn't convinced they were right. Blegen was a proponent of a more nuanced idea he called the kernel of truth. He argued that while Homer's poems were certainly not literal, word-for-word history, they could not have been invented from a vacuum. These stories, passed down through generations of oral bards before being written down, had to be rooted in the collective memory of a real, powerful civilization that had once dominated the Aegean. The detailed descriptions of geography, the specific types of armor and chariots, the elaborate burial customs, they were all too specific, too consistent, to be pure fantasy. He suspected that the German scholars, in their fervent rush to reject the flamboyant Schliemann, had thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They had become so focused on what Homer got wrong that they had neglected to consider what he might have gotten right. His attention turned to a sun-baked region in the southwestern corner of Greece called Messenia. In Book 3 of the Odyssey, Telemachus, the son of the wandering hero Odysseus, travels to sandy Pylos to seek news of his father from the aged king Nestor, the last surviving leader of the Greek forces at Troy. Homer's description of the place was vivid and geographically specific. Blegen began to wonder, what if a place like that had actually existed? While the Germans had definitively abandoned the hunt, Blegen began to plan one. He secured a modest grant from the University of Cincinnati, convincing the board with his quiet passion and rigorous logic. He assembled a small, dedicated team, including the brilliant architect William MacDonald, who specialized in matching ancient topographies to literary descriptions. Together, they set sail for Greece in the spring of 1939. Blegen wasn't chasing treasure or fame. He was chasing a hunch, an academic heresy that flew directly in the face of the world's leading authorities. He was looking for a ghost palace, a place Germany said couldn't be found. The local Greek villagers knew the hill by a simple name, Ano Englianos, or Upper Englianos. It was a broad, flat-topped ridge covered in ancient olive groves and sprawling vineyards, offering a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and the distant, shimmering Ionian Sea. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, utterly unremarkable to most. But for Carl Blegen, it was the culmination of a years-long obsession. He and MacDonald had surveyed the entire region, and this spot fit Homer's description perfectly. The skepticism of the Berlin school was a palpable weight in his mind, but standing on that Greek hill, his conviction hardened. This was the right place. On April 4th, he gave the order for the first trial trench to be dug. What neither Blegen nor his team could possibly know in that moment was that their shovels were about to strike not just a palace, but a historical jackpot so immense it would send shockwaves through the entire world of archaeology and prove an entire generation of experts spectacularly wrong. The impossible was about to become real. But as the first walls began to appear from the earth, a much darker shadow was falling over Europe, threatening to swallow their discovery whole. The day the myths came true. On the morning of April 4th, 1939, the air on the hill of Ano Englianos was filled with a tense, nervous energy. The small team, a mix of American archaeologists and local Greek workmen, stood ready. Blegen had chosen the spot for the first trench based on his scholarly interpretation of Homer. a deep knowledge of Mycenaean settlement patterns, and a few scattered pottery shards found on the surface. To an outsider, it was an educated guess, a shot in the dark. According to the prevailing German academic consensus, they should have found nothing more than a rustic farmhouse, or perhaps a minor Bronze Age village. There was no historical or archaeological reason to expect a major palace here. The great citadels of that age, like Mycenae and Tiryns, were all clustered hundreds of miles away in the Argolid Plain. Messenia was considered a provincial backwater, a forgotten corner of the Mycenaean world. Within the first hour, the impossible happened. A workman's pickaxe scraped against something solid just a couple of feet below the surface. The sound was unmistakable. Not the dull thud of earth or the sharp crack of natural rock, but the clean scrape of metal on worked stone. The digging stopped. The team gathered around as the dirt was carefully cleared by hand. It was a line of carefully cut limestone blocks, fitted together with precision. It was a wall. As they expanded the trench, they found another wall connected to it at a perfect right angle, forming a corner. The outlines of a room began to emerge from the red soil. Then came the first truly stunning find. A small fragment of painted plaster, a piece of a fresco that had fallen from a wall. The colors, vibrant blues, rich reds, and stark whites, were so perfectly preserved they seemed to leap out from the dirt, as if they had been painted only yesterday. This was no farmhouse. This was something far, far grander. The story of how the team felt in that moment has become the stuff of archaeological legend. There was a profound sense of disbelief, a collective feeling that it was all happening too easily, that it was too good to be true. Blegen, a man known for his calm, methodical, and famously understated demeanor, could barely contain his excitement. They were finding exactly what they were looking for, what he had dreamed of for years, on the very first day, in the very first trench. The titans of German archaeology had spent decades arguing it couldn't be done, that such a search was folly. And this small American team had seemingly stumbled upon it before lunch. Then came the discovery that would ultimately change everything, the find that elevated the site from a major discovery to one of world historical importance. While clearing the packed earth floor of that first small room, they found them. 5 small, flat pieces of baked clay. They were about the size of a modern-day bar of soap and were covered in strange, elegant, inscribed symbols. Blegen knelt down and recognized the script immediately. It was Linear B, the mysterious, undeciphered writing system of the Mycenaean civilization. At the time, Linear B was a profound enigma, and it was almost exclusively associated with the island of Crete and the earlier Minoan civilization. Only a tiny handful of fragments had ever been found on the Greek mainland. Finding them here in Messenia was a revelation. Finding them in what was clearly a palace archive room on the first day of a speculative dig was beyond belief. These tablets were administrative records, baked hard and accidentally preserved for eternity by the very fire that had destroyed the palace 1,200 years ago. What Blegen held in his hands was not just ancient pottery, it was lost literature, the bureaucratic paperwork of a forgotten kingdom. The tablets proved, in an instant, that this was not just a royal residence, but a major administrative capital, the heart of a complex and literate society. It was everything Homer had hinted at, and everything the German scholars had so confidently dismissed. The pace of discovery became frantic, almost overwhelming. Every shovel of dirt seemed to reveal something new. More walls, tracing out a vast architectural plan. More frescoes, depicting majestic griffins and lions, ancient symbols of royalty and power. More storerooms, their floors littered with the shattered remains of pottery. The sheer scale of the building was becoming apparent. They had not found a minor nobleman's villa. They had unearthed a true palace, a massive complex of courtyards, corridors, and staterooms covering several acres. For Blegen, it was the ultimate vindication. His faith in the kernel of truth within the Homeric epics had paid off in a way he could never have dared to imagine. He had found sandy Pylos. He had found the home of King Nestor. But as the spring of 1939 wore on, The news from the world outside their sun-drenched hill grew darker. The radio broadcasts were filled with talk of ultimatums and impending conflict. On April 7th, just 3 days into the excavation, Mussolini's fascist Italy invaded Albania, just across the Ionian Sea from Blegen's dig site. The threat of a continent-wide war was no longer a distant possibility. It was an imminent reality. The team knew their time was running out. They worked with a desperate, feverish urgency, trying to uncover and document as much as they could before they were forced to flee. They had just 6 weeks. By the end of May, the dig had to be shut down. Blegen made the painful, gut-wrenching decision to rebury what they had found. It was a heartbreaking necessity. The delicate frescoes and ancient walls were carefully covered over with earth, a solemn act to protect them from the coming storm of modern warfare. The priceless Linear B tablets, by then they had found several hundred, were packed up and secretly transported to a bank vault in Athens for safekeeping. The story of what happened next is a testament to the chaos of the era. The team packed their bags and left Greece just as the continent was about to explode into the Second World War. For the next 13 years, the Palace of Nestor would sleep again beneath its blanket of earth and olive trees. The greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century was abandoned, its secrets only partially revealed. The world descended into a global conflict that would claim tens of millions of lives and reshape the entire political map. During the war, Greece was brutally occupied, and the area around Pylos became a battleground for resistance fighters and occupying forces. Blegen, back in the United States, could only wait and wonder if his palace would survive, or if the secrets of King Nestor would be lost again, this time forever. A fascinating footnote to history is that Blegen himself was recruited into the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, using his intimate knowledge of Greek geography and culture to aid the Allied war effort. The archaeologist had become a spy. The initial mystery of whether the palace existed had been solved, only to be replaced by a new, more agonizing question. Would they ever be able to return and finish the job? The next discovery they would make would be even more mind-blowing than the first: secrets of the throne room. It wasn't until 1952 that Carl Blegen, now in his 60s, could finally return to his sleeping palace. The world had been irrevocably changed by the crucible of war. A generation had passed. Blegen and his team were older, grayer, but their determination had not waned. After the end of the global conflict, Greece itself had been plunged into a bitter civil war, further delaying their return. But now, at last, the country was stable enough. The hill at Anoenglianos had remained, patiently waiting. When the excavation team carefully removed the protective layers of earth they had placed there 13 years earlier, they held their breath. They found that the palace had survived the years of turmoil and conflict completely untouched. The great work could resume. What they uncovered over the next few seasons was breathtaking, exceeding even their most optimistic expectations. The full, staggering scale of the Palace of Nestor was revealed, and it was a structure that seemed to have been lifted directly from the pages of Homer's epics. The heart of the palace was the magnificent Megaron, or throne room. It was a vast, spectacular hall, nearly 43 feet long and 37 feet wide. Its high roof, once supported by 4 massive, decoratively fluted wooden columns. In the center of the room was a huge, circular ceremonial hearth, 13 feet in diameter, its plaster surface painted with incredible, intricate patterns of flames, spirals, and interlocking waves. This was not a simple fireplace. It was a sacred and symbolic center of power. Against the middle of the right-hand wall stood a raised dais, the spot where the king's throne had once been placed, flanked by a stunning fresco of a majestic griffin and a lion, ancient symbols of royalty and divine authority. The scene was so intensely evocative that the archaeologists could almost hear the echoes of Homer's words, describing heroes feasting and listening to bards in a smoky raftered hall. This was it. This was the center of power for a mighty Bronze Age kingdom. The level of preservation was astounding. The vibrant colors of the frescoes, which covered not just the walls, but, in some areas, even the floors, looked as if they had been painted only yesterday. They depicted a lost world of courtly life, religious processions, and brutal warfare. There were scenes of lyre players entertaining the court, of warriors in boar's tusk helmets, and of great feasting ceremonies, offering an unprecedented window into the lives and beliefs of the Mycenaeans. As the team expanded the dig, the palace revealed itself to be a sprawling, brilliantly organized complex of over 105 distinct rooms, courtyards, and corridors spread across at least 2 stories. It was a masterpiece of Bronze Age architecture, complete with sophisticated features like interior light wells to illuminate the windowless rooms and an elaborate clay pipe drainage system to handle rainwater. One discovery, in particular, captured the public's imagination and forged a direct, undeniable link to Homer. In a small chamber, designated Room 43, they found a built-in terracotta bathtub. The tub, called an aseminthos in ancient Greek, was painted on the inside and outside with decorative spiral patterns. It was an exact physical match to the type of bathtub described in Book 3 of the Odyssey, where Polycast, Nestor's beautiful youngest daughter, bathes and anoints Odysseus' son, Telemachus. For the first time, a specific, mundane detail from the epic poems had a direct, physical counterpart in the archaeological record. It was a stunning confirmation of the accuracy of Homer's cultural memory. But the palace was far more than just a royal residence. It was a bustling economic engine, the administrative hub of a prosperous kingdom. The team uncovered huge storerooms, or magazines, their floors crowded with the shattered remains of thousands of pottery jars. One section of the palace was a dedicated oil and perfume depot. In one room, hundreds of small stirrup jars were found, the ancient equivalent of a perfume bottle. Chemical analysis of the residue inside confirmed they had once held perfumed olive oil, a luxury export that made the kingdom wealthy. Another area was the palace pantry, where archaeologists found the remains of over 2,800 stemmed drinking cups, called kylikes, neatly stored on shelves, ready for a massive feast. The wine magazine, Room 105, contained the remains of enough enormous pithoi, or storage jars, to hold thousands of gallons of wine. This was concrete evidence of a kingdom that produced, stored, and distributed goods on a massive industrial scale. The palace wasn't just a home for a king, it was a center for taxation, manufacturing, and international trade. And then there were the tablets. The initial few hundred discovered in 1939 turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. As the excavation of the archive complex near the palace entrance continued, hundreds and hundreds more Linear B tablets were found. By the end of the dig, the total number would exceed 1,200. They were found clustered in 2 small rooms, exactly where a modern government might keep its records. They had been stored on wooden or wicker shelves, which had burned away in the final conflagration, causing the tablets to fall to the floor in neat chronological piles. The collection of tablets from Pylos was, and remains, the single largest archive of Linear B writing ever found on the Greek mainland. They were a historical treasure of immeasurable value, a time capsule preserving the inner workings of a lost civilization. They held the answers to who these people were, how they lived, how their kingdom functioned, and, perhaps most chillingly, how it all came to a sudden, violent end. The final layer of occupation in the palace was a thick deposit of ash and burnt debris, a clear archaeological signature of a catastrophic fire that had destroyed the entire site around the year 1200 BC. Among the ruins, the excavators found hundreds of bronze arrowheads, many of them unused and still stored in a box, a sign that the palace was overrun by invaders before its defenders could even fire all their ammunition. Blegen and his team had resurrected a lost world. They had a palace that matched Homer's descriptions, artifacts that illustrated the daily life of its inhabitants, and an entire library of records written in their own language. They had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that a great civilization had once thrived in this forgotten corner of Greece. They had overturned decades of German skepticism and validated Blegen's unwavering faith in the ancient legends. But the greatest secret of all, the meaning of the strange symbols inscribed on the clay tablets, remained locked away. The script was still unreadable. A new kind of search was about to begin. A search not with shovels and pickaxes, but with paper, pencils, and one of the greatest intellectual feats of the 20th century. The clay tablets were about to speak, and what they had to say would forge the final, unbreakable link to the world of Homer. The language of heroes. The 1,000-plus clay tablets unearthed from the ashes of Nestor's palace represented a monumental puzzle, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in archaeology. For decades, the Linear B script had been an absolute enigma. Its discovery is credited to the legendary British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, who in the early 1900s had excavated the sprawling Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete. There, he uncovered a brilliant, sophisticated civilization he named Minoan, and with it, he found hundreds of tablets inscribed with the same strange script. Evans, a towering figure in the field, was fiercely possessive of his discovery. He published very few of the tablets and for decades refused to grant other scholars full access, effectively hindering any real progress. He remained convinced, until his death, that Linear B was the written language of his non-Greek Minoans, a theory that became entrenched academic dogma. The task of deciphering a lost script without a key, like a Rosetta Stone, is considered by linguists to be almost impossibly difficult. The world's leading classicists and cryptographers had tried and failed. The problem was threefold. They didn't know the language the script represented, they didn't know the values of the symbols, and they didn't know if it was alphabetic, syllabic, or pictographic. The task was considered by many to be almost as impossible as finding the palace itself had been. The story of the decipherment revolves around two brilliant and very different minds. The first was Alice Kober, an American classicist and professor at Brooklyn College. Kober dedicated her life to the script with a painstaking, almost monastic devotion. Working in the 1940s, before the bulk of the Pylos tablets were even discovered, she brought a rigorous, scientific logic to the problem. She created a handmade database on over 180,000 paper slips cut from cigarette cartons, meticulously cross-referencing every known symbol from the limited publications. She was not a guesser. She was a logician. She proved, through pure statistical analysis, several crucial facts: that Linear B was written from left to right, that it was an inflected language where word endings changed to denote grammatical function, like in Latin or Greek, and she identified several key symbol groups that likely represented root words with different endings. Her work was the essential, unglamorous foundation upon which the final breakthrough would be built. Tragically, she passed away in 1950, never seeing the final solution she had brought so close. The second, and more famous figure, was Michael Ventris, a young, charismatic British architect. Ventris was a prodigy, a man gifted with a stunning aptitude for languages. As a 14-year-old boy, he attended a lecture by the 86-year-old Sir Arthur Evans and was instantly captivated by the mystery of the undeciphered script. He made it his life's hobby, a passionate intellectual pursuit he conducted in his spare time, completely outside of his day job. His status as an amateur was his greatest strength. It allowed him to approach the problem with a fresh perspective, free from the entrenched dogmas and biases of the academic world, particularly the Evans-enforced belief that the language could not be Greek. Using Kober's foundational logic and the massive new trove of data provided by Blegen's Pylos tablets, which were quickly published, Ventris created grids to chart the relationships between the 87 different syllabic symbols. He circulated his work notes to a small group of scholars around the world, creating a collaborative effort. Following a hunch, he began to analyze recurring word groups that appeared to be place names, like Knossos, the main city of Crete. Then, on a work note in June of 1952, he made a daring, intuitive leap. He took a few common words he had isolated at the end of lists and guessed they might be Greek. He plugged in the Greek words for things like total, tuso, and gendered endings for boys, kowo, and girls, kowa. Suddenly, the code shattered. The symbols lined up. The strange alien script began to resolve into archaic but recognizable Greek words. A word he had identified as a key commodity turned out to be ponike, phoenix, meaning crimson dye, or a griffin. Another was coriander. It was a eureka moment that echoed through the ages. Ventris, the amateur architect, had solved the riddle that had stumped the world's experts for half a century. The language of the Mycenaeans, the people of the Palace of Nestor, was indeed Greek, a very early form of it, hundreds of years older than the Greek of Homer and the classical alphabet. The decipherment was announced on BBC radio, and the news was an academic earthquake. At first, many were deeply skeptical, but the proof was irrefutable. In a moment of high drama, Carl Blegen himself put the theory to the test. He had just unearthed a new large tablet at Pylos, tablet Ta 641, and sent a copy to Ventris without any context. Ventris applied his system and sent back a preliminary translation. It was a detailed inventory of furniture, including 1 tripod cauldron of Cretan workmanship, 2 tripod cauldrons, 1 tripod with a single handle. The description of these tripods, high-status items of bronze, was so specific and so reminiscent of similar items described as treasure in the Iliad that all doubt was erased. The decipherment was real. The content of the tablets could now be read, and they opened a direct, unfiltered window into the world of King Nestor. What they revealed was just as shocking as the decipherment itself. They were not epic poems, royal histories, or religious texts. They were something far more mundane, and therefore far more fascinating. They were the day-to-day records of a complex, centralized, and highly controlling palace bureaucracy. The tablets were lists. There were lists of chariot wheels being repaired, with notes on which ones were serviceable and which were unserviceable. There were inventories of bronze armor, with each part, helmet, corselet, greaves, catalogued. There were lists of women, designated by their jobs, grain grinders, weavers, bath attendants, and the rations of wheat and figs they and their children were allotted. There were records of flax production, land grants to feudal lords, and offerings of perfumed olive oil sent to various gods and goddesses. They mentioned Poseidon, Hera, Zeus, and Artemis by name, proving the Greek pantheon was worshipped centuries earlier than previously thought. Most incredibly, the tablets painted a chilling picture of a kingdom preparing for its final battle. One set of tablets details the deployment of coast watchers. They record the stationing of military units at specific points along the coast, a last-ditch effort to watch for an invasion from the sea. The tablets list the names of the commanders and the number of men under their command, a bureaucratic snapshot of a kingdom on the brink of annihilation. For Homeric scholars, these lists were pure gold. They didn't tell the story of the Trojan War, but they confirmed the reality of the social and economic world that produced it. The title given to the king in the tablets was Wanax, an ancient word for a monarch that appears in the Iliad. The warrior elite who fought from chariots were a real social class. The geography described, listing the towns and districts that owed taxes to the palace, matched the geography of southwestern Greece. Blegen hadn't just found Nestor's palace. Ventris had unlocked Nestor's filing cabinet. In the final analysis, the combination of Blegen's archaeology and Ventris's decipherment provided the ultimate vindication. The German scholars had been spectacularly wrong. The Homeric epics were not just fantasies. They were the distant, poeticized memory of a real, powerful, literate Bronze Age civilization. The American archaeologist, chasing a hunch that Europe's experts had mocked, had not only located the physical remains of that world, but had also provided the key to hearing its voice again after more than 3,000 years of silence. But as people looked at all the incredible evidence, a nagging question lingered. Did this all happen as neatly as the story suggests? A simple tale of American ingenuity versus European dogma? Or are we still missing a crucial detail in this incredible tale? Did Blegen's unlikely success come down to genius, or was it just plain luck? Hit that subscribe button and let us know your thoughts below. Thanks for watching.